Hello, I'm Nick Gowing. Welcome to the Emmanuel Centre here in central London for this Intelligence Squared debate on how the West should respond to the so-called Islamic State, or ISIS. Beheadings, crucifixions, the attacks in Paris, control over billions of dollars in oil revenues, and extraordinary global digital power to influence people. Currently, IS controls significant tracts of territory in parts of Iraq and Syria, calling itself an Islamic caliphate. Western leaders say IS must and will be destroyed, and currently they're only using air power. The new Russian intervention to support Syria's President Assad has now complicated all of that. Some Arab states are in recent days considering deploying military force, including ground forces, against IS. Should the West do the same? So the motion for this Intelligence Squared debate, defeating ISIS means Western boots on the ground. We have an excellent panel for you. Arguing for the motion, four-star American General John Allen. Until last October, General Allen was President Obama's special envoy to the global coalition to counter and defeat ISIS. And Douglas Murray, the award-winning political commentator who specializes in the Middle East, terrorism and national security. Against the motion, Ken Livingstone, Mayor of London when the 7/7 attacks on public transport 11 years ago killed 52 people on the tube and on a bus. And Rula Jibrail, journalist and author, foreign policy analyst, focuses on Islamic extremism and the new political order in the Arab-Muslim world. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our speakers. Well, shortly you'll hear from the four speakers, two for the motion and two against. I'll then throw open the debate to all of you on the floor to hear as many views as possible from both sides, including the third view that you're undecided at the moment. Let's first, though, go to the opening statement from the four panelists. Speaking first for the motion, four-star US General John Allen. As a US Marine officer, he was involved in military operations in Iraq in Anbar province in 2007. He was President Obama's special envoy for the global coalition to counter ISIS until he chose to step aside late last year. General Allen, the floor is yours.
So let me start my portion of the debate this evening by utterly confusing the event. I am both for the motion, defeating ISIS means Western boots on the ground, and I'm against it. And let me explain. In any crisis like this, the decision to commit force falls into two broad categories. The decisions are not and cannot be binary. The reality will be that the actual commitment of force will exist along a spectrum of capabilities that generally are dictated by the political environment, by the strategy, and by the operational realities. So to the suggestion that we employ large-scale conventional formations, let me say that we're actually quite good at this. And there might be substantial short-term accomplishment which would make us feel good about that deployment. But in the longer term, and an even greater disruption of the political and social fabric is more likely the outcome in the region, a region that is in deep crisis now. The other choice, the one I strongly support, could generally be described as enabling the indigenous force. That is, supporting and training and equipping and advising and assisting local forces, ultimately to be the defeat mechanism. And so in the end, elements of both choices are necessary for defeating this scourge. So what does this look like? And let me just make three broad points. What we're doing, what we ought to do, and what else we might consider with respect to the commitment of forces. Critically, what we're doing now must enable and support the Iraqi security forces and Syrian opposition elements to physically defeat this organization on the ground. Whether that's the Sunni tribes or the Sunni Arab states, it is essential that the ownership for the defeat of ISIL be in the hands of the indigenous population of that region. As King Abdullah II of Jordan said, So in this, we're already seeing some success on the ground, given the forces from the West that have been committed. And these forces are performing the following functions: precision strike with coalition air power, as Nick said, advisors at various levels, which are scalable depending on the operational environment, the capacity building sites, training sites located in Iraq and in the region, where the indigenous population is being trained and equipped to be the lead elements in fighting ISIL. And now we're beginning to move some direct action, Tier 1 strike force elements into the region to pair with indigenous special operators to strike key ISIL targets as we discover them. That's what we're doing. What we should consider are additional advisors, which could accompany a broader spectrum of formations farther forward in the conflict, the potential employment of helicopter gunships, the creation of a joint special operations task force, either in southern Turkey or northern Jordan, manned by Western special operators, but dedicated to the training and the support of indigenous regional special operators so that they are supporting our Syrian partners and, to some extent, the Iraqis and the Kurds in taking the fight to ISIL. And then my one large formation recommendation is to create a mobile special operations or an airborne task force, again located outside Syria or Iraq, but very close, supported by combat aviation, which is transport and helicopter gunships, that can move very quickly to a vulnerability that we might detect in ISIL's outer crust, strike that vulnerability, crush it, turn it over to the indigenous population, withdraw quickly from the region, and prepare once again to go after the next vulnerability that ISIL might reveal. We should be considering how we in the West, with boots on the ground, can support stabilization operations for the liberation of populations from ISIL's domination. We have to give the displaced populations of Iraq and Syria a place to return to, other than potentially to come to Europe. So we should consider the temporary deployment of security forces to provide security to those liberated populations until indigenous forces can be trained for that security. So in the end, I'm both for the motion. It will require specialized and carefully calibrated and deployed Western, Arab, and Sunni military forces to defeat ISIL. They're doing it now. But I'm also against the motion that where we find ourselves today in this battle with ISIL, we should commit large-scale Western formation of combined arms forces. It boils down essentially to this: we do it and hand it off, or they do it with our help. History has shown over and over that the latter approach is the least disruptive to the social and the political environment and brings us the greatest likelihood of success. Thank you.
General Allen, thank you very much indeed with that carefully calibrated argument that certain boots on the ground will be helpful. Let's go now to the first voice against the motion. Ken Livingstone, one of Britain's most prominent and renowned political figures, been a long-standing critic of Western foreign policy, widely praised for how he led the UK capital's response to the 7/7 attacks in 2005. He recently caused outrage from some by saying the 4 bombers gave their lives in response to a war caused in part by British Prime Minister Tony Blair. Ken Livingstone, the floor is yours.
By saying I want to see ISIL destroyed, not just because it represents a threat to those of us living here in this city, as it did in Paris, but even more so because of what it imposes on the people that come under its control. The most awful brutality and beheadings and crucifixions, but the subjugation of women back into a sort of semi-medieval state. The question is, how do you do it? My fear is that if it's simply seen as Western troops on the ground, and there have to be troops on the ground, I suspect in their millions. If it's just seen as the West, though, I think that becomes a recruiting agent for other fundamentalist terrorists in many nations. It's got to be seen as the world acting together, not America and Britain and most probably France intervening in their own interests, which is how the West is perceived all over the Middle East. We have to look at the situation of involving nations like China and Nigeria and Brazil, so it is not seen simply as us once again intervening in the Middle East because of our desire to control the supply of oil. We also need to look at how this problem's arisen. It isn't just in Syria and Iraq, in Libya, in northern Nigeria where it's Boko Haram, in Mali. Right the way across the Muslim world, these intolerant terrorist organisations exist, and even if you destroy ISIS in one of its areas, that won't necessarily tackle, and won't tackle at all, those other areas. Where did this come from? The CIA estimates that in the 1990s, Saudi Arabia was spending $3 billion a year and funding the intolerant Wahhabi strand, which has helped to fuel not just ISIL, but also, of course, many other terrorist organisations, and in particular Osama bin Laden. Western governments have not been prepared to criticise Saudi, which has been the principal funder of Islamist terrorism and intolerance. Equally, if you look at our record of interventions, they have been disastrous. There was a democratic government in Iran in 1953, a sort of leftish guy called Mossadegh, who won the election fair and square. He then nationalised the oil. Britain and America organised the overthrow of that government, imposed the Shah, a brutal dictator, for 25 years. If we hadn't intervened in Iran, if we'd been prepared to pay them a fair price for their oil, we might see in Iran today a very Western-style and tolerant functioning democracy. Then, if you look at many of the other actions we've taken, whether it's been in Iraq, and you know as much about that as I do, it's been so well reported. The simple reality is Western interventions have been counterproductive, haven't resolved any of these crises, and if we wish to bring this terror threat to an end, we've got to look for a much broader coalition, bringing in, as I said, nations like China, who have many more troops available for this than most Western countries, one has to say. But it's about ending the double standards. Every day we see in the papers a criticism of Russia's appalling bombing of many innocent civilians in Syria, but virtually nothing about the fact that Britain is advising Saudi Arabia on the bombing of rebel groups in Yemen, causing equal, if not greater numbers of civilian casualties. The simple reality is great powers do terrible things. Whilst claiming to be fighting for justice and democracy, they actually defend their own interests. And that's how it's been for centuries. If we want to actually end this threat, which is growing and spreading, we've got to look beyond our own interests and build that broader coalition that will bring the millions of troops that you are going to need to eliminate this threat to us here in this city, but even more, the appalling horror they impose on the people they control in the areas under their command. Thank you very much.